The city was a skeleton. Empty buildings scraped the sky. Wind howled through shattered windows. He walked alone, a shadow in the dust. He felt a gaze on his back, turned. Nothing, just crumbling concrete and the ghosts of forgotten lives. The feeling persisted, crawling on his skin. He pressed on, heart hammering in his chest. Something moved in the distance, a flicker of colour against the grey. He squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. A trick of the light, he told himself that. But a seed of unease had been planted. Something was watching him. Days blurred together. The feeling of being watched intensified. He caught glimpses of the figure now, a woman, a flash of red dress disappearing around a corner. He followed, drawn by an unseen force. Each step filled him with dread, yet he couldn't stop. He had to know who she was, what she wanted. Her movements were unnatural, fluid like smoke on the wind. She never looked back, never acknowledged his presence. But he knew she was leading him somewhere, deeper into the heart of the abandoned city, towards something sinister. The air grew thick with the stench of decay. Twisted metal skeletons of factories loomed, monuments to a forgotten industry. The ground was littered with debris, rusted gears and broken glass crunching underfoot. Whispers seemed to emanate from the shadows. The wind carried voices, chanting in an unknown tongue. He shivered, pulling his coat tighter around him. The woman in red glided ahead, unfazed by the oppressive atmosphere. She moved with purpose, leading him toward a massive, derelict factory at the edge of the city. His heart pounded against his ribs. He felt a growing sense of foreboding. This place held secrets, dark and terrible secrets. The factory was a cavernous maw of shadows and dust. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of mildew and something ancient, something foul. He followed the woman into the heart of the building. A single flickering light illuminated a circle of figures. They were clad in dark robes, their faces hidden in the shadows. They chanted in unison, their voices echoing off the metal walls. In the center of the circle, a pit gaped open. He couldn't see the bottom, only darkness. A darkness that seemed to pulsate, to breathe. He felt a chill run down his spine. The chanting stopped. All eyes turned to him. He was trapped. The chanting resumed, louder this time. The floor vibrated beneath his feet. He tried to back away, but two figures grabbed him, their grip like iron. He struggled, but it was no use. He was dragged towards the pit. The stench intensified, making his stomach churn. It smelled of rot and decay, of something utterly alien. He caught a glimpse of movement in the darkness below. The chanting reached a fever pitch. The ground shook violently. He looked at the faces surrounding him. Their eyes were filled with a terrifying fanaticism. They believed in something down there, something monstrous. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. Coercion and chaos, a struggle in vain. They held him over the pit. He thrashed, kicked, screamed, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. His heart pounded in his chest, a drumbeat of desperation, but his struggles were met with laughter, cruel and mocking. The faces around him twisted in sinister delight, feeding off his fear. Cruel, mocking laughter that echoed in his ears, reverberating through the cavernous space, amplifying his terror. He was powerless to stop them. His strength waned, his spirit crushed under the weight of their malice. The air crackled with energy, a foreboding hum that filled the room. The stench became unbearable, a foul odor that clung to his senses. He gagged, bile rising in his throat. Then he saw it, a sight that would haunt his nightmares forever. Rising from the pit, a mass of writhing tentacles, each one moving with a life of its own, a grotesque dance of horror. They were slick with slime, pulsating with an unholy light, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The chanting reached a deafening crescendo, a symphony of madness that filled the air. The tentacles shot forward, wrapping around him, constricting with a vice-like grip. He screamed as they tightened, crushing the air from his lungs, his vision blurring as darkness closed in. He was falling, pulled down into the darkness, into the waiting maw of the unknown, his final thoughts consumed by terror and despair. The worm awakens, hunger consumes all. In the dead of night, the forest was silent, save for the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The air was thick with an unsettling mist, and the entrance to the cave loomed like a gaping maw. He landed in the slime, the stench overwhelming. The ground beneath him was cold and clammy, sticking to his skin like a second unwanted layer. The putrid smell filled his nostrils, making him gag. He could feel the tentacles tightening around him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. They were strong, unyielding, and their grip was like iron. Each pull dragged him further away from the light, deeper into the abyss. Panic surged through him, hot and blinding. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but finding none. Then he saw it, a colossal worm, its body a pulsating mass of flesh and teeth. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a nightmarish creature from the depths of his worst fears. Its eyes, cold and black, stared into his soul. They were devoid of any emotion, any hint of mercy. They were the eyes of a predator, and he was its prey. He felt a searing pain as something pierced his skin, burrowed its way into his flesh. It was as if his very essence was being invaded, corrupted by the creature's insidious presence. He screamed until his voice was raw. The sound echoed through the cavern, a desperate cry for help that went unanswered. His throat burned, but he couldn't stop. He thrashed until he had no strength left. His muscles ached, his body was battered and bruised. Every movement was a struggle, but he couldn't give up. But it was no use. The worm was inside him now, its hunger insatiable, its will absolute, his vision blurred. He could feel it taking over, consuming him from the inside out. The world faded to black. His last thought was of the creature's cold, unfeeling eyes and the darkness that awaited him. A vessel chosen, a mind erased. He woke with a gasp, his heart pounding in his chest. He was lying on the cold concrete floor of the factory, the chills seeping into his bones. The cult members were gone, leaving behind an eerie silence that echoed through the empty space. He tried to sit up, but his body felt heavy, alien, as if it no longer belonged to him. His thoughts were sluggish, his mind clouded with a fog that he couldn't shake off. He looked down at his hands, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. They were covered in slime, pulsating with an eerie light that seemed to have a life of its own. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, his voice trapped within him. He was trapped in his own body, a prisoner in his own mind, unable to break free. The worm's consciousness was seeping into his own, erasing his memories, his personality, everything that made him human. It was a slow, torturous process. He was becoming a vessel, a puppet for the ancient entity to control, his will no longer his own. His last coherent thought was filled with despair. The worm had won, and he was lost forever. Spreading the hunger, the cycle begins anew. He walked out of the factory and into the ruins of the city. His movements were jerky, unnatural. His eyes glowed with an unholy light. He was no longer human. He was a monster. The worm's hunger burned inside him, a raging inferno that could never be quenched. He had to feed. He had to spread the worm's influence. He stumbled through the deserted streets, his body a ticking time bomb. He was the harbinger of a new age, an age of darkness, an age of the worm. The cycle had begun anew.